The question of whether a war can ever be morally right is not a new one. It is honestly a heavy question that has troubled thinkers for thousands of years. Long before our modern era, philosophers and theologians grappled with the devastating reality of armed conflict. They sought to find a way to distinguish between wars of pure aggression and those that might be fought for a justifiable cause. The Roman statesman Cicero was one of the first to formally write about this. He argued that war should only be a last resort, used to restore peace and punish wrongdoing. Cicero believed that even in conflict, certain duties and rights must be respected, laying the groundwork for a moral framework. This early thinking was later adopted and expanded within Christian theology, most notably by Augustine of Hippo in the 4th and 5th centuries. Augustine lived during a time of great upheaval as the Roman Empire was collapsing. He had to reconcile the Christian message of peace with the harsh reality that states sometimes needed to defend themselves. He argued that while individuals should turn the other cheek, a state had a solemn duty to protect its citizens from grave harm. For Augustine, a just war was not a good thing, but a tragic necessity undertaken with a heavy heart to prevent a greater evil and to secure a just peace for all involved. Centuries later, in the 13th century, the philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas took these scattered ideas and organized them into a more systematic theory. Building upon the foundations laid by Cicero and Augustine, Aquinas set out clear conditions that had to be met for a war to be considered just. He was not trying to make war easier to start. Instead, he wanted to create a strict moral checklist that rulers would have to consider before sending their people into battle. His work became the cornerstone of what we now call just war theory, a tradition that tries to place ethical limits on the use of state violence. Aquinas proposed 3 essential conditions. First, the war must be declared by a legitimate authority, like a king or a government, not by private individuals seeking revenge or profit. Second, there must be a just cause, meaning the war is fought to right a serious wrong, such as defending against an attack or reclaiming something that was unjustly taken. Finally, the war must be fought with the right intention. The goal must be to achieve a just and lasting peace, not simply to gain more power, seize land, or inflict needless suffering on the enemy. These principles sought to ensure war was never taken lightly. Just war theory is built on 2 main pillars, each with its own set of rules. The first pillar is called jus ad bellum, a Latin phrase that means the right to go to war. This set of criteria helps us decide if starting a war is morally permissible in the first place. The principles laid out by Aquinas form the core of jus ad bellum. They include having a just cause, like self-defense against aggression. The decision to fight must also be made by a proper authority, ensuring that the choice is a public one, not a private vendetta. Furthermore, the intention must be to restore peace, not to pursue vengeance or territorial expansion for its own sake. Beyond these core ideas, jus ad bellum includes several other important conditions that add further moral weight to the decision. One key rule is that war must always be the last resort. This means that a state must have tried every other peaceful option to resolve the conflict, such as diplomacy, negotiations, or economic sanctions, before turning to violence. Another condition is that there must be a reasonable chance of success. It is considered morally wrong to lead people into a hopeless war where the only outcome is certain death and destruction without achieving the just cause. This prevents needless sacrifice and pointless suffering. The second pillar of the theory is jus in bello, which means justice in war. This part of the theory deals with how a war must be fought, regardless of the reasons it started. Even if a country is fighting for a just cause, it does not have a license to behave however it wants. The rules of jus in bello are meant to protect human dignity and limit the suffering caused by conflict. The 2 most important principles here are discrimination and proportionality. These rules apply to every soldier on the battlefield and every commander making strategic decisions, creating a standard of conduct. The principle of discrimination is fundamental. It demands that fighters must always distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, Soldiers can be targeted, but civilians, aid workers, medics, and wounded soldiers cannot. This is why international law protects hospitals and schools. The goal is to keep innocent people out of the line of fire as much as possible. The principle of proportionality relates to the amount of force used. It states that the harm caused by a military action must not be excessive in relation to the military advantage gained. For example, one cannot destroy an entire city just to eliminate a single enemy sniper hiding within it. The ethical principles of just war theory are not just abstract ideas debated by philosophers. They have become a core part of modern international law. After the horrors of the two world wars, nations came together to create a system to prevent such devastation from happening again. The United Nations was founded on the idea of collective security and peaceful dispute resolution. The UN Charter itself reflects jus ad bellum principles. It strictly prohibits the use of force by one state against another, with two major exceptions: self-defense against an armed attack, and when the UN Security Council authorizes military action to maintain international peace and security. The rules of jus in bello, which govern conduct during a war, are most clearly seen in the Geneva Conventions. These treaties are the bedrock of international humanitarian law. They set out detailed rules for the protection of people who are not or are no longer taking part in the fighting. This includes civilians, prisoners of war, and the wounded and sick. The conventions forbid torture, hostage-taking, and humiliating treatment. They require that medical personnel and facilities be protected. These laws directly translate the moral principle of discrimination into legally binding obligations for all nations who agree to them. Another significant development is the establishment of the International Criminal Court, or ICC, through the Rome Statute. This court embodies the idea that individuals, not just states, can be held accountable for their actions during a conflict. The ICC has the power to prosecute individuals for the most serious crimes of international concern: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. This directly relates to the just war idea of right intention and just cause. By holding leaders and soldiers personally responsible for ordering or committing atrocities, the ICC reinforces the message that even in war, there are laws that cannot be broken. These legal frameworks are not perfect, and their enforcement can be difficult, often depending on the political will of powerful nations. However, their existence is a powerful testament to the influence of just war theory. They represent a global consensus that war, when it cannot be avoided, must be constrained by rules. These laws provide a standard against which the actions of nations can be judged. They offer a language for condemning aggression and protecting the vulnerable, transforming ancient moral arguments into a practical, though imperfect, system for limiting the brutality of human conflict and seeking accountability for those who violate its core tenets. Despite its long history and influence on international law, just war theory faces significant criticism. One of the most common arguments is that its principles are, well, just too subjective and can be easily manipulated. What one nation considers a just cause, like a humanitarian intervention, another might see as an act of aggression or, simply an excuse to advance its own interests. The idea of right intention is also really difficult to prove, since leaders can publicly claim their goal is peace while secretly pursuing power or resources. This kind of subjectivity can actually make the theory a tool for political propaganda, allowing powerful nations to justify their wars while condemning those of their rivals. Another major challenge comes from pacifism. Pacifists argue that the entire framework of just war theory is flawed because it accepts that violence can sometimes be a legitimate solution. From a pacifist perspective, war is always morally wrong, regardless of the reasons it is fought. They believe that violence only creates more violence, and that there are always non-violent alternatives, even in the face of extreme aggression. They would argue that providing a moral justification for war, even a limited one, ultimately makes it easier for societies to accept conflict and harder to build a truly lasting and sustainable peace built on cooperation. The nature of modern warfare also presents new and difficult questions for the theory. The development of technologies like cyber warfare and autonomous weapons, or so-called killer robots, blurs the traditional lines of conflict. Is a massive cyber attack that cripples a country's infrastructure really an act of war? And who is responsible if an autonomous drone makes a mistake and targets civilians? These technologies challenge the principles of discrimination and proportionality, as it can be quite difficult to control their effects or assign accountability. The theory, which was developed in an era of swords and shields, honestly struggles to keep up with the speed and complexity of 21st century conflict. Furthermore, the so-called war on terror has stretched the concepts of just war theory to their limits. Conflicts against non-state actors like terrorist groups just do not fit neatly into the traditional model of war between nations. Questions arise about what constitutes a legitimate authority when fighting a decentralized network, or even when a war is officially over. The use of targeted killings via drones in countries where there is no declared war raises really profound legal and ethical issues. These modern dilemmas show that while just war theory provides an essential moral language, it must constantly be re-evaluated and adapted to address the changing face of global conflict. The principles of just war theory are tested constantly in modern conflicts, revealing both their relevance and their limitations. The debate over humanitarian interventions, for example, goes right to the heart of jus ad bellum. When a government commits atrocities against its own people, do other nations have a right or even a duty to intervene with military force? Proponents argue it is a just cause to prevent genocide or mass slaughter. Critics, however, point to the risks of making situations worse, violating national sovereignty, and the potential for the intervening powers to have mixed motives, as was debated during the NATO intervention in Libya in 2011. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine provides a starkly clear example of just war principles in action. From the perspective of the theory, Ukraine's fight is a textbook case of a just war of self-defense. The cause is just resisting a blatant act of aggression and defending its territorial integrity. The decision was made by its legitimate government, and the intention is to restore its sovereignty. Conversely, Russia's justification for the war has been widely rejected as a pretext, making its actions a clear violation of jus ad bellum. This conflict has revitalized discussions about the crime of aggression and the importance of international law in holding nations accountable for starting unjust wars. This moral framework stands in sharp contrast to the theory of Realpolitik, which views international relations purely through the lens of power and national interest. For a follower of Realpolitik, moral and ethical considerations are irrelevant or at best a secondary concern. The only real question is whether a war will make a state more powerful or secure. Realpolitik does not ask if a war is just, only if it is winnable and beneficial. Just war theory, on the other hand, insists that power is not enough. It argues that legitimacy and justice are essential, and that a state's actions must be judged by a moral standard that transcends its own self-interest. In the end, the goal of just war theory is not to make war more acceptable, but to make it less frequent and less brutal when it does occur. Its rules are difficult to apply perfectly, and they are often ignored or twisted by those determined to fight. Yet, its enduring importance lies in its refusal to accept that war is a realm without morality. By providing a framework for judgment, it gives us the language to condemn aggression, to demand protection for the innocent, and to hold leaders accountable. It keeps alive the hope that even in humanity's darkest moments, we can still strive for justice and work toward a more peaceful world.